Thank you very much, Dr. Monaghan, for that excellent analysis. It was most interesting. Our next speaker, Dr. Priscilla Coleman, is a professor of human development and family studies at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. She has published more peer-reviewed articles on the mental health implications of reproductive outcomes than any other researcher in the world, and she frequently presents her research to global audiences. The outlets for her nearly 50 peer-reviewed journal articles have been in various disciplines, including psychology, family studies, education, and medicine, among others. Dr. Coleman is currently on the editorial board of 5 international psychology and medical journals. She will present to us today on the topic of the relative safety of abortion versus childbirth, a focus on psychological morbidity and mortality. Can you all join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Priscilla Coleman?
Thank you. It really is a pleasure to be here. We were here back in March for about 20 hours, so we had a tease of Dublin, and I had no idea I'd be back so soon and have some time to see your beautiful city here. And I also am impressed with the speakers, and I just really appreciate being part of this symposium. So the title of my presentation, again, is Abortion versus Childbirth, a focus on psychological morbidity and mortality. The questions that I'll address today: first, what are the characteristics and situations that put women at the most risk for mental health problems following abortion? What are common negative post-abortion mental health responses? Is there evidence that childbirth is psychologically safer for women? And is the risk of death higher among women who abort compared to women who give birth? I recently searched the Medline, PubMed, and PsycInfo databases for articles identifying demographic, personal, relational, and situational factors that increase women's risk for post-abortion mental health problems. This is the basic results here, and I can't take full credit. Last summer, I was able to convince my poverty-stricken 23-year-old son to help in the process, so I feel I should give him some credit. He would never help me now. He's studying schooling behavior in fish, so I nabbed him while I could, and we were able to identify 400 potentially relevant studies from 1972 to 2011. 258 articles were closely examined for relevancy, and we narrowed that down to 119 original studies that we summarized and evaluated. So what are the most well-established risk factors for mental health problems in the research literature? First, the pregnant woman is pressured or coerced by others to abort. 9 studies document this risk. She's religious or views an abortion to be in conflict with her personal values. 10 studies. The pregnant woman was ambivalent about the abortion, experienced decision difficulty, and/or had a high degree of decisional distress. 21 studies. She was committed to the pregnancy, or she preferred to carry the child to term. 7 studies. Belief that abortion terminates the life of a human being, and/or the woman experienced a bond with the fetus. 6 studies. She had pre-abortion mental health or psychiatric problems. 31 studies. The pregnant woman was an adolescent or young woman at the time. 15 studies. She was in a conflicted, unsupportive relationship with the father of the child. 4 studies. The pregnant woman experienced negative relationships with others, and that could take the form of parents, peers, a wide range of people in the woman's life. Character traits suggesting emotional immaturity, instability, or difficulties coping were present. 42 studies document this risk. Indicators of poor quality abortion care, feeling misinformed, inadequate counseling, negative perceptions of staff, etc. 10 studies. And it's important to realize that many of the risk factors are complexly interconnected. For example, a woman who feels attached to her fetus and desires to continue the pregnancy may also be pressured from her partner to abort if the relationship is unstable, leading to feelings of ambivalence and stress surrounding the decision. If she suffers from low self-esteem and has trouble articulating her feelings, she may be particularly prone to yielding to the pressure and suffering afterwards. So how common are some of these risk factors? Well, 44% of women have some doubts about their decision to abort upon confirmation of pregnancy. 46% of women who abort report a conflict of conscience. 25% of women who abort view it as terminating human life. And actually, there's some other studies that indicate that it's maybe as high as 50%. 50% of American women who abort feel it's morally wrong. So 40 years of research have shown that when specific physical, psychological, demographic, and situational factors are operative in women's lives, they are at an increased risk of experiencing mental health problems after the procedure. Even abortion doctors agree. 2 decades ago, Hearn emphasized the central role of pre-abortion counseling in evaluating women's mental status, circumstances, and abortion readiness to prevent complications. Hearn also discussed the necessity of the counselor being trained to assess whether the abortion patient is a victim of subtle coercion. And then Baker in '95 similarly stressed pre-abortion screening for risk factors 17 years ago. In her book titled Abortion and Options Counseling, she stated, in the cases where women do react negatively after an abortion, there appear to be predisposing factors linked to those reactions. There's enough valid research from which we can attempt to assess a client's potential for negative reactions after an abortion. Baker recommended identifying these predisposing factors prior to an abortion: belief that abortion is murder, low self-esteem, ambivalence about the decision, intense guilt and shame about the abortion, perceived coercion to have an abortion, and commitment to the pregnancy. The American Psychological Association in 2008 released a report that was supposedly an unbiased assemblage of all of the relevant research pertaining to both risk factors and also outcomes. I served as a reviewer for the document. I received it in 2007 on my way to Portugal to speak. I had only a month to write an evaluation. I was afraid I may have a heart attack on the plane because the initial draft didn't include approximately 40 studies, and there's a lot that was difficult or incorrectly done methodologically with that report, and the final version was not much better, and I could probably speak for 2 hours on that, but suffice to say that I do not believe it was an accurate portrayal of the research. But in the area of risk factors, it was undeniable that there are these established factors, and in their report, they note a wanted or meaningful pregnancy, pressure from others, opposition to the abortion from partners, family, and or friends, lack of social support, commitment to the pregnancy, ambivalence, and low perceived ability to cope. So all of these risk factors were acknowledged in that report. And despite the availability of strong research documenting risk factors and professional awareness, abortion providers rarely, if ever, routinely screen for risk factors and counsel women at risk. Now, turning to the psychological consequences, there is an abundant literature comprised of methodologically sophisticated studies from around the world that now indicates abortion significantly increases risk for the following mental health problems: depression, anxiety, substance abuse, suicidal thoughts, and behavior. A minimum of 20% of women who abort suffer serious, prolonged negative psychological consequences. Abortions further associated with a higher risk for negative psychological outcomes when compared with unintended pregnancy carried to term. And the data indicate that risk for long-term psychological injury is considerably higher with abortion than with other forms of perinatal loss. Some of the strengths of the studies published over the last 10 years include larger samples, many of which are nationally representative. There are controls for prior psychological history, controls for personal and situational variables associated with the choice to abort. We have long-term data collection with low dropout rates, use of appropriate comparison groups, comprehensive measures of mental health, often with actual diagnostic codes assigned by trained professionals. And so I'd like to just give you a sampling of some of the recent studies from around the globe. In 2008, Ferguson and colleagues published a study in the British Journal of Psychiatry showing the following increased risks associated with abortion when compared to unintended pregnancy delivered. Suicide ideation, there was a 61% increased risk, and alcohol dependence, 188%, illicit drugs, 185%, major depression, 31%, and anxiety disorders, 113% increased risk, shown in this study from New Zealand. In Australia, published in the same issue of the British Journal of Psychiatry, was a study by Australian researchers Dingle and colleagues. Women with an abortion history had nearly twice the risk for depression compared to women who had not aborted. Abortion history was further associated with an almost 3 times greater risk for illicit drug use and 2 times the risk for an alcohol disorder. And then in Norway, Peterson published 2 studies linking abortion to mental health problems. Data for both studies was from a nationally representative sample and included over 700 respondents. Women who aborted had increased risks of nicotine dependence, alcohol problems, marijuana use, and other illicit drugs, huge increased risks here. And there was nearly 3 times as likely as their peers without an abortion experience to report significant depression. China, this study just came out. The title is published in the Bulletin of Clinical Psychopharmacology. Data were derived from the Anhui Birth Defects and Child Development Cohort Study, and the sample consisted of nearly 7,000 women, approximately half of whom had experienced at least 1 abortion. Women with a history of an induced abortion a year or more prior were 49% more likely to experience depression and 114% more likely to experience anxiety in the first trimester of a later pregnancy compared to women who had not experienced an abortion after controls for maternal education, income, place of residence, and BMI were applied. There were no differences between women with and without a history of spontaneous abortion. Okay, and now I'd like to turn to discuss this meta-analysis. The strongest studies published between 1995 and 2009 are synthesized in my recent meta-analysis published in the British Journal of Psychiatry. It came out about a year ago. By systematically combining the numerical results from many high-quality studies addressing the same basic question, here our question is there an association between abortion and mental health? Very reliable results are produced. Studies are weighted statistically, and meta-analysis offers a logical, more objective alternative to traditional reviews. And I had criteria for inclusion. I only included studies with a sample size of 100 or more participants. There had to be a comparison group, either no abortion, pregnancy delivered, or unintended pregnancy delivered. 1 or more mental health outcome variables in these categories: depression, anxiety, alcohol use, marijuana use, or suicidal behaviors. And all of the studies had to include controls for variables associated with the choice to abort. The first meta-analysis, which included 36 adjusted odds ratios from 22 studies, resulted in a pooled odds ratio of 1.81, which means that women who have had an abortion experience an 81% higher risk for mental health problems of various forms compared to women who have not had an abortion. And I know you can't see the detail here, but you can see the systematic effect. If there was not an association between abortion and mental health, all of those horizontal lines would be centered around the middle line, but they're shifted to the right, indicating a systematic effect. A second meta-analysis was conducted with separate effects based on the type of outcome measure, so divided up by marijuana, suicidal behaviors, alcohol use or abuse, depression and anxiety, and the level of risk associated with abortion varied from 34% to 230% depending on the nature of the outcome. Here's another graphic of the meta-analysis, shifted around a little bit based on the outcome measure. Alcohol's at the top, suicide's at the bottom. And then in a third meta-analysis, separate pooled odds ratios were produced based on the type of comparison group, no abortion carried to term or unintended pregnancy carried to term. And depending on the type of comparison group employed, abortion was associated with between a 55% to 138% elevated risk of mental health problems. The lowest was for the unintended pregnancy carried to term as the comparison. Here is the same data, shifted again based on the type of comparison group, delivery followed by no abortion, and then unintended pregnancy delivered. Looking at population attributable risk percentages from the pooled odds ratios, we were able to definitively say that nearly 10% of the incidence of mental health problems was directly attributable to abortion. So let's look sort of in contrast, what are some of the psychological benefits of abortion that have been of motherhood that have been established in the literature. A number of studies have shown positive psychological characteristics, including an increased sense of control, feelings of serenity, self-esteem, empathy, ego resilience, defined as a capacity for flexibility and resourcefulness in coping with stressors, and assertiveness associated with motherhood. According to Ellison, frequent close contact inherent in the daily care of a young child results in expanded maternal brain activity and neural growth. As mothers monitor and attend to children's needs, brain circuits related to empathy are expanded. According to Fleming, a researcher at the University of Toronto, elevated cortisol levels in new mothers may boost attention, vigilance, and sensitivity. When comparing 248 British women experiencing a planned pregnancy to 182 women experiencing an unplanned pregnancy, Deave in 2005 found that 87% of women who planned their pregnancy and 79% of women who did not reported feeling pleased or overjoyed just prior to delivery. They were all first-time mothers residing in low socioeconomic areas. In a study by Rokach, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, mothers in their first year of parenting scored significantly lower on a loneliness questionnaire than a subsample of women from the general population, and the subscales included emotional distress, social inadequacy and alienation, interpersonal isolation, and self-alienation or detachment from oneself, a feeling of numbness. I love that picture. If women breastfeed, there are additional benefits as lactation produces the antidepressant chemical oxytocin. Studies suggest lactating mothers are less tense and become bored less easily than their non-lactating peers. The hormonal activity and neural circuitry associated with childbirth and lactation reduces depression and anxiety. Carter and Unvas Moberg, leading authorities on oxytocin, have provided scientific evidence suggesting that the brain becomes more receptive to the impact of oxytocin after the first heavy dose during labor and breastfeeding. Hormones of pregnancy and early motherhood apparently facilitate formation of subsequent strong personal relationship bonds. But what about postpartum depression? The incidence rate for postpartum depression is between 3.4% and 11%. However, this form of depression tends to be less serious than major depression, which has been shown to afflict 20% of women after abortion. Moreover, postpartum depression is very unlikely to precipitate suicide. So is childbirth protective against death due to suicide? Gisler and colleagues in 2005 reported the annual suicide rate for women of reproductive age to be 11.3 per 100,000, whereas the rate was only 5.9 per 100,000 in association with birth, and was a startling 34.7 per 100,000 following abortion. Several other studies conducted in various countries have revealed even lower rates of suicide in the year following birth when compared to non-postpartum samples. In the U.S., the postpartum suicide rate was found to be only 1.4 per 100,000. In the United Kingdom, there was a report in the mid-'80s, a very low rate of postpartum suicide of 5 per 100,000 live births. In a population-based study, Appleby reported in the British Medical Journal that pregnant women are 1/20th as likely to commit suicide when compared to non-pregnant women of childbearing age. Appleby concluded, quote, "Motherhood seems to protect against suicide." In a review of literature, Lindahl and colleagues concluded that suicide deaths are lower among postpartum women compared to the general population. A recently published study in obstetrics and gynecology by Raymond and Grimes that you may be familiar with, comparing mortality statistics associated with induced abortion and childbirth, is actually a dangerous distortion based on seriously incomplete data. In arriving at their conclusion that abortion is many times safer than childbirth, Raymond and Grimes relied only on data from the CDC to secure numbers of deaths related to childbirth and induced abortion. The authors acknowledged underreporting, but they made no attempt to address the factors associated with this shortcoming, nor did they discuss the magnitude of the problem. They said, quote, "Weaknesses include the likely underreporting of deaths, possibly differential by pregnancy outcome, abortion, or childbirth." Raymond and Grimes also failed to address abortion-related deaths beyond the first trimester, which constitute 12 to 13% of all abortions. Using national U.S. data spanning the years from 88 to 97, Bartlett and colleagues reported the relative risk of mortality was 14.7 per 100,000 for 13 to 15 weeks gestation, 29.5 at 16 to 20, and an alarmingly 76.6 at or after 21 weeks. Acquiring and disseminating accurate data pertaining to maternal mortality are long-standing global concerns. According to the World Health Organization, quote, "Maternal deaths are hard to identify because this requires information about deaths among women of reproductive age, pregnancy status at or near the time of the death, and the medical cause of death. All three components can be difficult to measure accurately." There are variable definitions also of maternal mortality. For example, maternal death, according to the World Health Organization, is one that occurs during pregnancy or within 42 days of termination from any cause related to or exacerbated by the pregnancy or its management, not including accidental or incidental causes. Pregnancy-associated death is defined by the CDC as any death during pregnancy or within 1 year of the pregnancy outcome, irrespective of cause. Pregnancy-related death, a subtype of pregnancy-associated death, is reserved for complications of the pregnancy itself, events initiated by the pregnancy, or the aggravation of an unrelated condition by the physiological or pharmacological effects of the pregnancy. The data reported by abortion clinics in the U.S. to state departments and ultimately to the Centers for Disease Control significantly underrepresent abortion mortality for several basic reasons. First, abortion reporting is not required by federal law, and many states don't report abortion-related deaths to the CDC. Second, deaths due to medical and surgical treatments are reported under the complication of the procedure, for example, infection, rather than the treatment, the abortion. Most women leave abortion clinics within hours of the procedure and go to the hospital emergency rooms if there are complications that may result in death. Suicidal deaths are rarely, if ever, linked back to abortion in state reporting of death rates. An abortion experience can lead to physical and or psychological disturbances that increase the likelihood of dying years after the abortion, and indirect abortion-related deaths are not captured at all. A study of pregnancy-associated deaths in Finland revealed that without data linkage to complete pregnancy and abortion records, 73% of all pregnancy-associated deaths could not be identified from death certificates alone. Inconsistent definitions and incomplete data confined to a very brief window of time has left society largely in the dark regarding true mortality risks associated with pregnancy generally and with particular outcomes, most immediately after pregnancy resolution and across the years that follow. Large population-based record linkage studies containing complete reproductive history data in conjunction with data related to deaths provide a unique opportunity to bypass many of the limitations of the currently available maternal mortality data in most countries. Gisler in '97 reported post-pregnancy death rates within 1 year were nearly 4 times greater among women who had an abortion, 100.5 per 100,000, compared to women who carried to term, 26.7 per 100,000. Miscarriage had a mortality rate of 47.8 per 100,000. In 2004, Gisler and colleagues again found that mortality was significantly lower with a birth, 28.2, than with a spontaneous abortion, 51.9 per 100,000, and following an induced abortion, 83.1 per 100,000. So now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about a couple studies that we recently had published. When I developed this PowerPoint last week, they had been accepted, but now they've both been published. So they're in the literature, and I believe they're both available freely. So we used Danish population data. I had to analyze the data remotely. It was pretty complicated to get into the system. I think it took longer to figure out how to work it virtually than it took to run the analyses, but we were able to merge data from Statistics Denmark, the National Hospital Register, which had the pregnancy losses, the fertility database, which had the births and stillbirths, the National Board of Health Abortion Registry, and centralized civil register for the death dates. The study included all women in Denmark born between the years 1962 and 1993 who were alive on the 1st of January 1980 and didn't die prior to age 16. So this is over 1 million women. The average age of women at the end of their first pregnancy was 25 and 29 at the end of their last pregnancy. The average number of pregnancies per woman was 1.2. The 5,137 recorded deaths occurred between January 11th, 1980 and December 31st, 2004, and the mean age at death was 27 years. The first study, titled Reproductive History Patterns and Long-Term Mortality Rates, a Danish population-based record linkage study, has now been published. I think this one published second. I think it was on Sunday or Monday it came out, and Dr. Byron Calhoun is a co-author on this as well. So the objectives of Study 1, the general purpose was to explore the effects of particular patterns of pregnancy resolution, induced abortion, miscarriage, and birth on mortality rates over an extended time period, 25 years. Specifically, we sought to examine the following. One, any detrimental and or protective effects of distinct forms of pregnancy resolution over time, detrimental and or protective effects of distinct forms of pregnancy resolution occurring repeatedly over time, and elevated or attenuated mortality risks when distinct pregnancy outcomes are combined with other forms of pregnancy resolution. With controls for the number of pregnancies, year of birth, and age at last pregnancy, having experienced only induced abortions and natural losses was associated with over 3 times the risk of death from all causes compared to only having experienced births. Then the risk of death was over 6 times greater among women who had never been pregnant compared to those in the births-only group. Compared to a reproductive history that only included births, after instituting controls, increased risks of death were as follows. Only induced abortion compared to only birth was 66%, only natural losses, 181%, all reproductive outcomes, the woman experienced all 3 possibilities, 94%. And then compared to no experience of abortion, increased mortality risks after applying controls were evidenced for the following. 1 abortion, there was a 45% increased risk. 2 abortions, 114%. And if the woman had 3 abortions, it was 191% increased risk. Similarly, increased risks of death were equal to 44%, 86%, and 150% for 1, 2, and 3 natural losses, respectively, compared to no natural losses. Significantly decreased mortality risks were evidenced with multiple births. 2 births were associated with an 83% lower risk of death compared to no births. 3 or more births corresponded to a 44% decreased risk over no births. Study 2 was published about a week ago in the Medical Science Monitor, and I know this one is freely available. I haven't checked on the other one yet. So the purpose of the second study was to examine mortality rates that are associated with the first pregnancy outcome. Also to examine differences in mortality rates associated with early abortion and later abortions after 12 weeks. In this study, we had nearly 500,000 were included, close to that, who had their first pregnancy between 1980 and 2004. And in this study, 2,238 had died. Compared to women who delivered, the age and birth year adjusted cumulative risk of death for women who had a first trimester abortion was significantly higher in all periods examined from 180 days through 10 years. The risk of death was significantly higher for women who had abortions after 12 weeks from 1 year through 10 years. And the data were somewhat incomplete with the later abortions, so those results are not as reliable as the early abortions, just due to the low numbers. But for women who miscarried, the risk was significantly higher for cumulative deaths through 4 years and at 10 years. There are studies with different conclusions regarding the mental health risks, and so I would like to kind of address that. I've critiqued several reviews like the American Psychological Association review and several original studies that have been published in recent years, and they're available on the website for the World Expert Consortium for Abortion Research and Education. The web address is there. This has just been around for a year. I've been so motivated to get this information out to the public, and it's very difficult in terms of media coverage and just getting basic data out to the average professional in training. And so my hope is that this will be a vehicle not only for dissemination, but for international collaboration. Unfortunately, I was able to do it very cheaply because my wonderful son-in-law is a web developer for Ohio State. I think he might have used like a canned program for this because it's not terribly complex, but it has content management so I can load materials. I am satisfied, and I'm glad he was able to do that. So we've kept the cost down very low. My next plan is to try to fundraise. I have no clue how to do that. I have a PayPal button, and I've noticed over the years, this first year, nobody's ever pressed that PayPal button, so I'll have to figure that out next. But it's been very effective in terms of being able to post timely responses to papers that come out and so forth. So what I would like to do briefly today is highlight a few of the major shortcomings that characterize one recent original empirical paper and a review, not the APA, but a review that came out afterwards that you may be familiar with by the Royal College. So this is just background, but beginning with the APA report in 2008, there have been several narrative reviews. It's not the only one. There really have probably been 4 or 5 at least on abortion and mental health, along with a number of original papers published suggesting that abortion is generally not associated with adverse mental health consequences. Careful examination of the methodologies of both types of studies reveals serious problems, and the results should therefore not be trusted as a basis for professional training protocols or healthcare policy initiatives. So I'm going to start with one by Munk Olson and colleagues. The title was First Trimester Induced Abortion and Risk of Readmission to a Psychiatric Hospital in Women with a History of Treated Mental Disorder. And this was published in the prestigious Archives of General Psychiatry. The main result reported main results were that risk of psychiatric readmission was similar before and after first trimester abortion. However, risk of readmission was higher after giving birth compared to before birth. Well, there are some serious methodological problems in their study. First, the older women in the population for whom data are available, and I know that because I worked with the Danish data to produce our 2 papers on mortality. So they're not included, and there isn't any explanation for leaving them out. Second, out of the total sample of 8,131 women, nearly 12% were in both the abortion and the birth groups. How can you be comparing the groups if you have overlapping women? I teach a basic research methods class, and I think a 3rd grader could understand that you have to have distinct groups when you're making comparison like that. There were no controls for variables shown in previous studies to predict the choice to abort. There were not any controls for marital status, education level, religion, income, relationship history variables, including abuse, planning of the pregnancy, and pressure to abort, among others. In one of their earlier studies, it was amazing to me. In the introduction of their paper, they described the issue of 3rd variables and criticized the literature generally for not including these controls. And yet, in that very same study, I think that one was published in 2010, all they included were controls for age and parity. So they had the nerve to identify a major flaw and then to be guilty of that in their own analysis. Fourth, follow-up was limited to 12 months, despite the availability of data in the Danish registries enabling much longer tracking. 40 years were possible. The authors also conducted correlational analyses and inappropriately made inferences of causality. Now, so that's the problem with just an example of one of the empirical papers, and now I'd like to look at the systematic review of induced abortion and mental health that was released by the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Came out in December last year. The bottom line conclusion of the reviewers was that women who terminate unwanted pregnancy do not face increased risks of mental health problems compared to women who give birth. And then let's look at some of the issues. 35 studies, most identifying mental health risks, were eliminated based on the nebulously defined no usable data. They don't explain what they mean by no usable data, or fewer than 90 days follow-up. Well, only including studies with extended follow-up minimizes the number of cases of mental health problems identified. As time elapses, healing may naturally occur, other events may moderate the effects, and more confounding variables may be introduced. Finally, this approach misses the serious and more acute episodes that are treated soon after the abortion. The studies included were not representative of the best available evidence. For example, in the prevalence of disorders category, only 34 studies were retained, including 27 without controls for previous mental health. As the author of the Coleman 2011 review cited in the report, I was alarmed to see the content in the section Summary of Key Findings from the APA, Charles, and Coleman reviews. The first 6 points are not reflective of the conclusions in the meta-analysis, and the 7th and final point wrongly states, with reference to the meta-analysis, that, quote, previous mental health problems were not controlled for within the review. Well, in my meta-analysis, 14 out of 22 of the studies did include controls for prior mental health problems. Third, the review was pitched as methodologically superior to all previously conducted reviews, largely because of the criteria employed to critique individual studies and to rate the overall quality of evidence. However, the quality scales employed to rate each individual study are not well validated and require a significant level of subjective interpretation, opening the results to considerable bias. And am I getting close on time? So to conclude, with scientifically derived information, commitment, and compassion, we can assist professionals as they endeavor to empower women to make healthy decisions for themselves and their families. Thank you.